Says, hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our topic today with Providence. With us today, we have this wonderful researcher that you're going to learn a lot from, and we're just so excited to share some of the findings that she has uncovered with her research. My name is Lori Kelly, and I lead philanthropy at the Providence Foundations. And I'm really excited to share with you some good news today and some interesting news that we have. As a reminder, the information provided today during this event is for educational purposes only. If you have any questions regarding medical conditions or treatment plans, please consult your physician. So with that, we will get started today. And joining me today is a new friend. I just met her, Dr. Samantha Picos. She's a researcher at the Institute for Systems Biology here in Seattle. And she's also a Carol Ellison Fellow in Bioinformatics at the Institute for Systems Biology. And we're here today to talk with Samantha about her new research on how maternal COVID-19 infections increases the risk of preterm low birth weight and stillbirth. So a very serious topic for the times. And so Samantha, tell us a little bit about, before we get started, your work. And I mean, your bio is a whole page long of all the amazing research that you've been doing. So tell me about what's your job as a researcher at the Institute for Systems Biology before we dive into the questions.
Thanks for the introduction, Lori. So I am a postdoctoral fellow. That means I have my PhD and I'm continuing to do research in under a more experienced researcher before I transition to a faculty position myself. So that would be a professor at a university would be my ultimate goal. My day-to-day is actually really cool. I get to ask questions that I'm wondering about, such as, does a maternal COVID-19 infection impact birth outcomes? And then I get to go from just having that question to actually figuring out how to solve it. So that means, going in and saying, hey, we're partners with Providence. Can I have access to the electronic medical records that will help me answer this question? And figuring out how to design the experiments, test them out. You want to ask the question a few different ways to make sure that you're getting consistent results. And so, yeah, that's really cool. And then I get to share my findings with the world and hopefully, have a positive impact and help people improve their lives.
Well, and in fact, speaking of sharing these findings with the world, you've been published a lot recently with the study in Science Magazine, in the NIH, the Lancet, CBS News. So this is a study, this is an area that a lot of people are curious about. There's a lot of questions out there. So tell me first, how did you decide this was the area that you wanted to research, maternal health with COVID?
Yeah. So my PhD is in stem cell biology. And so the thing about that is you get to study all of biology throughout pregnancy. And what's interesting about pregnancy is you get to study what goes right in biology, because all too often there's a huge emphasis on studying things about what happens when things go wrong. But with pregnancy, like, you get to learn about all of biology, because all of that happens when the baby is developing. And it's something where you can see like biology working correctly. And so that's why I was drawn to pregnancy in particular as a topic. I also think it's something that is incredibly important. We all went through this process. It's one of the few processes that every single human on the planet shares in common. And it has massive impacts on, what happens in pregnancy can have lifelong impacts on that baby. And so it's an incredibly important topic. I think it's interesting. There's also I feel that there needs to be more emphasis on maternal fetal health in general, more focus. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Obviously, COVID is the big topic of our times right now. And so it was just a natural fit to ask, how does maternal COVID-19 infection impact birth outcomes?
Great. Yeah. So you started, when did the study get kicked off?
So this was my first project at the Institute for Systems Biology. So I started in September of 2020, and this is
Okay.
what I decided to focus on when I started my postdoc.
So COVID was raging for about, at that time, about 9 months in the United States, right? So how many women were in the study?
Yeah. So it was for 9 months, which made it an ideal time to start because with pregnancy, you have to wait after the
Yeah,
exposure event to
right.
see actually the birth outcome. So we included we observed about 77,000 births during our time
Wow.
period, which includes from March of 2020 through the start of July of 2021. Of those, we limited it to people that had a COVID test during pregnancy. Of those, over 800 tested positive, and then we had another 17,000 that tested negative. At this point, when we look at the people that tested positive for COVID versus that people that tested negative for COVID, so didn't have COVID that we know of during pregnancy, those two groups look very different. And so you're not making an apples to apples comparison if you just straight up compared those two groups, because they're different on a number of demographic, medical conditions, underlying medical conditions, and other factors that we know impact birth outcomes. So at that point, what I did was I used machine learning to match and identify people that we didn't have a recorded um, uh, event of COVID for these patients, to make sure that they were
Mhm.
similar to the people that did have COVID during pregnancy on a number of these demographic and birth characteristics and underlying medical conditions. So at that point, we narrowed it down to 889 patients that matched our positive control, or our positive group, which was 886 women, or people, I should say.
Okay. Great. If you're just joining us this afternoon, we're talking with Dr. Samantha Picos. She's just published a study looking at COVID, the impacts of COVID-19 and maternal health, and or actually, I guess it's the baby, the health on the baby and the mother. So tell us again, you had this study, conducted it over COVID. Were some of the people in the study, had they been vaccinated by this time? Because you said you started it, in 320, no vaccines were out in March last of the 2020, but then finalized it with patients in July 2021. So by that point, people had been vaccinated. So how did that factor into that?
That's an excellent question. So since we were studying birth outcomes, we required all COVID-19 infections to have taken place prior to February 14th of 2021. The vaccines were just
Okay.
rolling out this time, and they weren't available for the general population. So looking at the patients that had COVID-19 during pregnancy, none of them were vaccinated at time of infection.
Okay. Okay. So what were the findings? What did you find out from people that had COVID, and what happened with their birth experience?
So the big findings
I'm
were
sure
that
you found out a lot.
yeah, so a COVID-19 infection during pregnancy increased risk for preterm birth, uh, low birth weight, uh, lower birth weight, and stillbirth, as well as small for gestational age. And what that means is you're accounting for the gestational age of the baby at delivery when considering whether or not the baby is small, because somebody that's born preterm is going to be smaller than somebody born at term. So after that adjustment for gestational age, determining that the baby is in this smaller fetal growth percentile in the bottom 10% at birth.
So smaller babies, and then talk about the impact of stillbirth. How did you compare that to, the normal percentage of babies that unfortunately are not born alive? I know that's a very small number. Don't want to scare anybody out there, but what was the findings with that piece?
So what we're doing is we're looking at the number of stillbirths in the patients that had COVID-19 while pregnant, and there were 6 stillbirths in that group, and we compared that to our matched control. So these are, again, people that match our positive group on a number of demographic features, and we only observed 1 stillbirth in that group. And
Okay.
that gives us enough signal to say, yes, we are observing stillbirth at a higher rate in patients that had COVID-19 during pregnancy.
And did the severity of the COVID infection factor into that at all, or were you able to ascertain whether that was something that someone had a really terrible case of COVID versus a mild case? How did that factor in?
That's an excellent question, and that's another important finding from the paper, is that this was not associated with COVID severity. So there was no correlation of the gestational age, so how long the baby develops prior to birth is not correlated with the severity of COVID infection, or whether or not the patient received supplemental oxygen. And that's super important, that even mild infections are of concern. And if you are pregnant and think you had a COVID-19 infection or had a COVID-19 infection, it's important to share that information with your doctor.
Okay. Yeah. Talk about birth outcomes overall with those babies. What did you find out that was different from the general population that did not have COVID? Were the birth outcomes more negative?
Yes. So, like we said before, increased rates of there was elevated rates of preterm delivery, of lower birth weight, of stillbirth. But also, what we found when we really dove into gestational age was that the biggest predictor for gestational age at delivery following a COVID-19 infection during pregnancy was the timing of that COVID-19 infection, with an earlier gestational age at COVID-19 infection being correlated with an earlier gestational age at delivery.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah. There was some rumor, I don't know if it was true or not, early on in COVID, in 2020, that a lot of women weren't testing positive for COVID, but we're almost sure they had it. And we even had a friend that was hospitalized, tested negative for COVID, had a baby 3 weeks early, kind of similar things that you're saying, but I think that she had COVID when she did deliver. So what are you finding out about that? Is that true at all?
So with that, you can always get an antibody test. If you are vaccinated, make sure to check that the antibody test will pick up targeted regions that are not the spike protein to make sure that you don't get a false positive there from being vaccinated. And that antibody test checks out whether there are markers like left behind in your immune system that say, hey, we're ready to fight COVID-19, the virus itself. And so that's something, if you think you've had it, but you're not really sure, if the symptoms are that similar to COVID. That's something that you could do for your own peace of mind. With that, we were just using the results of the PCR COVID-19 test for the study.
Okay. Okay, good. Another thing that I think, a lot of people don't realize this size and scope of Providence as a system. We're in 7 states. We have 55 hospitals, 1,100 medical clinics, I think 1,185, something like that. So we see a lot of patients. And so with that, our database is, as you noted, quite extensive. And also there's a lot of diversity within our database, which is really fantastic because we treat a lot of different patients from various backgrounds and so forth. So what other factors played a role? Did you see, was race or ethnicity or comorbidities? Were those some of the causes of some of these cases that really had less than optimal outcome?
So coming through, any of those demographic features weren't coming through as the big predictors. I should note, though, that looking at the patients that had COVID-19, that population was different. The majority of those patients were of Hispanic ethnicity, which it was disproportionately higher than patients that tested negative. And we've seen this throughout the pandemic, that different communities have experienced COVID-19 at different rates and have been disproportionately impacted. And that's why it's super important to take this into consideration, that there are differences in who has contracted COVID-19 and when throughout the pandemic.
Yeah. If anyone out there is listening and has a question for Dr. Picos, please send it in. We'll do our best to answer any questions that you might have. I know that this is one of those areas that probably a lot of people aren't familiar with the study, and so want people to know that there are really brilliant scientists looking out and studying this. Is just such a new phenomenon for us. So we're just so delighted to have Dr. Picos from the Institute for Systems Biology with us here today at Providence. So, another question I had is just, we talked about it a little bit earlier on, but the vaccines were not available when the study took place. And so now, of course, most people have been vaccinated. I don't know what the percentage is, but I think the majority has, but there's still a lot of people without the vaccine. Are you going to do more now that there are more people vaccinated and boosted, or are you going to wait, or what will be the follow-up to this?
That is my follow-up study, Lori. Thanks for asking. Yeah, no, that's what I'm studying right now, is the impact of COVID-19 vaccination on birth outcomes. So doing a follow-up on that. There are, since January, there's been several studies that have come out that says there's no impact, no association between COVID-19 and changes in preterm birth weights and stillbirth. So those rates are the same as the unvaccinated cohort. And so that's really reassuring for anybody that's concerned on that end. So I think it's very important to emphasize that getting the COVID-19 vaccination protects mom and it protects the baby. So you're getting double protection there. Getting COVID-19 during pregnancy does increase your risk for more severe COVID-19 infection, which includes higher rates of hospitalization, ICU admission, ventilation, and death. So those are all bad outcomes for mom if she has COVID-19, or if they have COVID-19 during pregnancy. And also what this study and others have shown is there's an increased risk for baby as well following a maternal COVID-19 infection during pregnancy, where there's no negative associations with the vaccine. So what we have is a known risk of COVID-19 compared to no known risk with the vaccine.
Yes, that's amazing. So I know there's a lot of people still worried about the vaccine, but what we've seen, and I remember even when I got my vaccine, there were two pregnant doctors getting one next to me, and I thought, okay, they know the science, and they're obviously expecting, and so I'm hoping that people will get the cue that it is definitely something that will keep you healthy, keep your family healthy, and in this case, keep your baby healthy. So, so talk about a little bit. I just think it's so interesting. You're coming out of your doctoral program. You're a postdoc in a pandemic. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people that are, scientists and researchers, I mean, what a time to be in medicine, right? So talk a little bit about what your other options are for studying and what some of your colleagues might be working on related to COVID.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Lori. It was very weird. I did defend my PhD virtually. Um, so that was definitely a unique experience. And then moved cross country in the pandemic to join the Institute for Systems Biology in Seattle. So yeah, it's an interesting time. Um, but the Institute for Systems Biology has a number of people who are asking a lot of interesting questions about COVID-19. The Institute just recently published the first study looking at risk factors for developing long COVID. You could catch that breakdown of that in the New York Times. And so we have a lot of interesting work looking at how the COVID-19 affects the immune system response, and how we can try and predict patient outcomes. There's long COVID projects that are currently ongoing. It's definitely a topic that we will be researching for years to come.
Yeah. Yeah, and with that, I'm in philanthropy and raise money for a lot of projects, and I can't think of a more worthwhile project than supporting this scientist and the researchers at the Institute for Systems Biology, doing amazing work. A lot of it is funded by foundations and some from government, but there's always private sources needed too. We can't do enough research on this. This is a once in a lifetime, hopefully, occurrence, and so we just really need the more money that is invested in this research, the faster we're going to find out solutions to some of these new problems that we're facing as a society. So a couple questions from the audience. And the first one is there a certain COVID vaccine more preferred for pregnant women? So we have Johnson & Johnson, the Pfizer. Yeah.
Either mRNA vaccines. So those are Moderna or Pfizer. It would be recommended just to follow the 2-dose series and then get a booster shot at 6 months.
Okay, great. And then if you're vaccinated and then get pregnant after that, will the baby be protected from COVID?
So there has been evidence that if you get vaccinated while pregnant, that the antibodies are transferred to the baby during pregnancy. I am not aware of anybody that's looked if mom is vaccinated prior to pregnancy, whether that same effect is observed. It's also something that might come out shortly, just because of the timing of when vaccines were broadly available and then having to wait for somebody to become pregnant and then deliver.
Yeah, right. It's it's still, even though it seems like we've been in this a long time, it is a short time to examine, as you noted earlier. You're almost pregnant. I always think 10 months, more than 9 months. It is 40 weeks. Yeah. So it's a long, you have to wait all that time to do studies and conduct that. What specific advice would you give someone who's pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant if they haven't gotten the vaccine? They're still worried about getting the vaccine. What would you tell them?
So my advice would be to follow medical professionals, including the CDC, the WHO. The scientific evidence is that the vaccine is helpful to protect you and your developing baby during the pregnancy, because getting COVID-19 while pregnant has this increased risk for mom and baby, it's understandable to be nervous about making such a difficult personal decision. But it is something where the evidence is pretty universal that this is something that is positive, for both you and your developing baby to get the COVID-19 vaccine.
Great. Okay. Well, that's a great endorsement. Want to also remind everybody that Dr. Picos has just been published in a lot of national journals, and we will run that. We'll put in the chat links to the article so that you can see more for yourself based on the research that she's done with hundreds and hundreds of patients. So really, I encourage everyone to get as much information as you can on this topic. It's very important. With that, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Picos. It's been great to visit with you today. Is there any last comments that you'd like to make before we close out?
Yeah, I think the takeaway messages are even a mild COVID-19 infection can increase risk for adverse birth outcomes. So if you are pregnant and had COVID-19 or think you had COVID-19, please share that information with your doctor. And also, it's recommended that if you're pregnant or thinking of becoming pregnant, to get vaccinated for COVID-19. Thank you so much for having me, Lori.
Great. It's just been great to talk with you, and I'm always so inspired by these young researchers, and just we're so lucky to have such smart people in our midst that are doing just really important work. So thank you for all you do. I know it takes a lot of time and energy, and I know the quest for the truth in science is something that you guys all believe in so strongly. So I would just really want to say thank you. We are honored to be working with you all. So thanks again to Dr. Picos today for joining us, and to everyone for listening and sending in your questions. If you're looking for medical advice, please visit us online at providence.org. And please make sure to follow Providence on all your social channels. We are on at Providence on Twitter. We're under Providence Health System on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And that's all for today. I hope everybody has a great weekend wherever you are. Please stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again. Bye-bye.